Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Welcome back to part 2 here in our lesson on the estimate cost process. In part 1 you saw the overview and inputs, and now we're moving on to the tools and techniques and outputs and a review as well, and we also have some sample exam questions for you as well. Let's do a brief overview of the 10 tools and techniques that we apply in this process and that are still ahead of us in this lesson. It all begins with expert judgment. Then we have analogous estimating, parametric estimating, bottom-up estimating, and 3-point estimating. That is closely followed by the reserve analysis, by the cost of quality, project management software, vendor bid analysis, and finally group decision making techniques. Let's begin at the beginning. According to the PMBOK guide, expert judgment is judgment provided based upon expertise in an application area, knowledge area, discipline, industry, and so on, as appropriate for the activity being performed. Such expertise may be provided by any group or person with specialized education, knowledge, skill, experience, or training. Cost estimating, with so many factors involved, is partly an art and partly a science. So use expert judgment that is available along with other inputs to help make better decisions about cost estimates. For example, if you are using previous similar projects as the basis of an estimate, you are using some expert judgment along with historical information. Next on the list of 10 tools and techniques are the different estimation techniques, and project cost management here uses some of the same techniques that we've already seen under project time management. First, there is analogous cost estimating. This uses values from previous projects as the basis for estimating the same parameters for the current project. Then we have parametric estimating, which uses statistical relationships between relevant historical data and other variables to predict cost estimate for the current project. In other words, 2 meters of cable cost X, which means that 200 meters of cable will cost you 100 times as much. We also have 3-point estimating, which uses the most likely, most optimistic, and most pessimistic costs to approximate a cost range. Similar to 3-point estimates for time, 3-point cost estimates can use triangular or beta distribution to calculate expected costs. These 3 techniques, they should look familiar to you from the lessons on estimate activity durations. There is one technique that is used in cost estimation that is not a technique that applies to project time management, and that's bottom-up estimating. We know that analogous estimating is almost like making a broad guess. In contrast, bottom-up estimating goes down into the individual work packages and estimates each one in detail. Then you aggregate the costs of the individual packages into an overall estimate. The smaller or more granular the work packages that you use in your estimate, the greater the level of accuracy of your final estimate. However, you have to counterbalance the level of accuracy with the cost and the level of effort required to perform this estimate. Keep in mind, to come up with a more accurate estimate, it may require more resources and experts, or like even multiple experts, to work on the estimate the more you go into the details. So overall, if you compare bottom-up with analogous estimating, bottom-up estimating expends more effort and is more costly, but it is more accurate than analogous estimating. Our next tool and technique is the reserve analysis, and the PMBOK guide defines 2 types of reserves: the contingency reserve. This is budget within the cost baseline or performance measurement baseline that is allocated for identified risks that are accepted and for which a contingent or mitigating responses are being developed. And then we have the management reserve. This is an amount of the project budget that is withheld and under management control. These are budget reserves for unforeseen work that is within the scope of the project, and the management reserve is not included in our performance measurement baseline. Let's take a look at these in turn, beginning on the left with the contingency reserve. The contingency reserve is also referred to as the contingency allowance. It addresses the known unknowns. For example, in a software development project, you're bound to have bugs, but you don't know how many and you don't know how much rework you're going to have to do. So a contingency reserve can be assigned to account for the rework that is required to fix defects in newly developed software. A contingency reserve can be assigned at the activity level or at the project level, or both. It can be a fixed number or a percentage of estimated costs, and the contingency reserve may change, and it is not necessarily static. It can be removed, increased, or used as you go through the project. It is updated as part of the cost baseline. It is part of the budget and the funding requirements of your project, and, very important here, the contingency reserve is owned by the project manager. Moving on to the management reserve on the right. It addresses the unforeseen or unknown unknowns, things that you couldn't come up with today that may just go wrong and impact your project. It's not part of the cost baseline. However, if the management reserve is used and applied to your project, it must be added to the cost baseline. Note that this update to the cost baseline requires a proper change approval. It's part of a budget and funding requirements of the project, and as the name implies, the management reserve is owned by management as opposed to the contingency reserve, which is owned by the project manager. If you, as the project manager, have an unknown happening on your project and you need to fall back on the management reserve, well, you have to get approval from management before you are allowed to tap into the management reserve. There are 4 more tools and techniques that we need to review, beginning with the cost of quality. We discuss this in the lessons on quality, so we won't go much into detail here. Cost of quality includes all costs to ensure that the quality specifications are met. Then we have project management software. Here you just have to understand that they exist, that more and more companies are using them, that they help you in estimating, and that they can simplify the estimating process, allowing you to change your data and consider various options quickly to get cost alternatives. These can be spreadsheets, simulations, statistical tools, or financial tools. Then we have the vendor bid analysis. This is a somewhat unknown tool, but it's just what its name implies, an analysis from the bids of a vendor. The assumption is that you have bids from a number of vendors, and you can now take the numbers of vendor A, B, C, and D and analyze them and compare them and see how they estimated your project and what they think your project should really cost. And finally, the group decision-making techniques. Team-based and consensus approaches can be used to come up with and agree on estimates. Examples of these are brainstorming and the Delphi technique and the nominal group technique. These approaches are useful not only in improving the accuracy of the estimate, but also in gaining the support of the participants that help us with creating these estimates. Moving on to the outputs of the estimate cost process, we have primarily the activity cost estimates. Also important are the basis of estimates and, of course, updates to our project documents. The activity cost estimates are pretty straightforward. These are your cost estimates for each activity. Activity A will cost 100 Swiss francs, activity B will cost 2,000 Swiss francs. This cost includes all the resources, both direct and indirect, that you need on the task, like labor, material, equipment, and so on. It may also include allowances for inflation or a contingency reserve amount. And it is always a good idea to include additional detail with your estimates, which is why the basis of estimates is an output of this process. The basis of estimates explains how you came up with the numbers that you are giving as your estimates. How you document depends on your corporate requirements, and the supporting detail as part of the basis of estimates may include documentation on the basis of your estimates, the assumptions and constraints that you had, the method of estimation or how exactly your numbers were developed, the scope of work for the activity that is in question, and you should also mention any ranges. For instance, it will cost 2,000 euros plus minus 10%. You should also indicate a level of confidence in the estimates. For example, we're 90% confident that this is what it is. And remember, a few slides back we talked about risks and contingency reserves? Well, that may lead you to update your risk register, which is part of your other project documents that may require updating. When it comes to actually doing your estimates, you can either do a detailed, more accurate estimate, or you can do a broad and less accurate estimate. Parametric estimating and bottom-up estimating, they will give you a detailed, more accurate estimate. Analogous estimating, on the other hand, gives you a broad, less accurate estimate. We covered in this lesson that three-point estimating takes the approach of using an optimistic, a pessimistic, and a most likely estimate, and then calculating a weighted average. And if you are detailed in these estimates, you'll get a more accurate weighted average for your three-point estimate. But if your estimates, your three-point estimates, are broad, you will end up with a less accurate weighted average. And this is where your estimating methods land in terms of accuracy. More accurate on the left, less accurate here on the right. Let's take a little detour here on how to set the right cost expectation with your sponsor or others that you work with on the project. The first rule of setting cost expectation is do not provide a single number estimate. Memory can be a tricky thing. Let's say, based on doing some analogous estimating, you think that your project is going to cost 100,000 euro, which you then communicate to the customer. The project is going to cost 100,000 euro. You know what will happen? The single number that you have just provided, it's going to seem like it is set in stone, despite other development and events which may arise on the project. Psychologically, your customer may likely only remember and come back to your very first estimate, and they will say, but you told us that was only going to be 100,000 euro. To avoid setting the wrong expectation, what can you do? Well, the answer is simple. Follow the second rule. Give a range for an estimate. The size of the range is dependent of the type of estimate that you have done and your degree of confidence in your estimates. So never provide a single number estimate. Always give a range. The PMBOK guide differentiates between two ranges of accuracy. First of all, the rough order of magnitude, ROM. This is used when you have a low degree of confidence in your estimate, especially early on in the project life cycle. The PMBOK guide says that this is minus 25% to plus 25% in regards to the estimating range. And then it also talks about the definitive estimate. This has a narrower range. It's used when you have a higher degree of confidence in your estimates. This would be the case later on in the project when there is less unknown and more has developed and you are more certain about what you can estimate. The numbers here are minus 5% to plus 10%. But when it comes to these estimating ranges, please be aware that there is really no definitive authority on these numbers. Yes, ROM, according to the PMBOK guide, minus 25% to plus 25%. Definitive is minus 5% to plus 10%. You must know these numbers for the PMP exam, but they're not set in stone in real life. It's different in every industry. It can be different from project to project. It can be different according to your company culture. Maybe in your organization, a rough order of magnitude estimate is minus 50% to plus 50%. But for the PMP exam, these are the two definitive numbers that you must know. Let's take a look at when it is most appropriate to apply each type of estimation range. We first of all need to examine the method of estimation. So, use a rough order of magnitude estimate if you are doing analogous estimating where you are less confident with the numbers, but do use a definite estimate if you're doing bottom-up, if you're really going into the details and estimating almost every single task. We also need to consider how much experience and knowledge we have on this type of project. So use a rough order of magnitude estimate for project, let's call it project X, a unique project, an unknown project, something we've never done before. But if you have project R, a known project, a repeat project, then use a definite estimate. To quantify this, let's go back and let's say we're still having a project here that has 100,000 euros in cost. That's the number that came out of our rough order of magnitude estimate. It came out of the definite. So we have 100,000 euros. For project X, that means, well, it's a ROM. It's got to be minus 25% to plus 75%. So 100,000 minus 25 would be 75,000 plus 75 is 175. So we're going to give this as our estimate to the customer between 75 and 175. On the other side, project R, again, we have an estimate of 100,000 euros, but because this is a definitive estimate, we have a range of minus 5% to plus 10%, which means that from a 100,000 euros, we take 5% away. We end up at 95,000 euros to 110,000 euros. And as you can see, because of this estimation range, when you give a rough order of magnitude, the spread is much greater than when you give a definitive estimate. So what type of questions do we see online and in commercially available exam simulators? Well, the tools and techniques of this process are the biggest focus. So you have to know what the tools are, but most importantly, how and when they are used. You should also understand the difference between the contingency reserve and the management reserve. And you have to be able to read a scenario-based question and then be able to determine, is the project manager now accessing the contingency reserve to solve a problem, or is this the management contingency reserve? And to show you that it's really not just important to know the names of the tools and techniques, but understand what they're doing, let's take a look at that. What tool and technique matches the following short description here? Our first tool and technique looks at an earlier and similar project to do an estimate, and our second tool and technique multiplies the hourly rate by the number of hours. Did you recognize them here? Of course, the answer is if you look at an earlier similar project and you say, oh, this one cost 100,000, this new one here is a little bit more expensive, more difficult, 105,000, you're doing analogous estimating. If, however, you multiply the hourly rate by the number of hours, well, you're using parameters to make a calculation, and therefore this is parametric estimating. I have two more for you, two other descriptions of cost estimation tools and techniques, and what do they match? So the first one, you calculate the weighted average of 3 estimates, and the second one, apply a formula to define reserve requirements. So what do we got in the answer here? What is calculating a weighted average of 3 estimates? The answer is really in the question itself. 3 estimates, 3-point estimating here is the answer. And when you apply a formula to define your reserve requirements, for example, on all our tasks that have a risk of X, we're going to add 10% on top of that. This is your reserve analysis. Let's review. In estimate cost, a lot has to have happened before you can get to this point. You cannot estimate without a planned scope. You cannot estimate without some understanding of the resources that are involved. You should never give a single number for a cost estimate. Instead, give a range. The size of the range depends on your level of confidence and method used in estimating costs. You should also know the benefits and differences between the various estimating techniques like parametric estimating and bottom-up estimating or analogous estimating. And of course, don't forget that the contingency reserve is owned by you, the project manager, but that the management reserve or the management contingency reserve is owned by management, and that you will have to go and beg for this second type of reserve if you need it. Ah, yes, your primary output of this process are your activity cost estimates. This, of course, is accompanied by the basis of estimates and any related project document updates. We have now reached the end of this lesson. So Justine says,
break a leg.
And I say, until next time.